In my recent video, How a Knight Shall Be Armed, I received many great questions in the comments, of which some recurring questions were in relation to leg armour. Specifically, why did soldiers often forego leg protection? Were there any methods to protect the exposed parts of the leg? And how do you defeat a knight wearing all this armour? In keeping with the theme of my previous video, I will be focusing on the 15th century when full plate armour had pretty much reached its pinnacle in protection and innovation. So, in today's video, let's attempt to answer your questions regarding leg armour. Armourers all throughout the medieval period have had difficulties in coming up with a way to protect the inner thighs specifically. There have been various attempts to cover the most vulnerable parts of the legs, be it with the use of demi-cuisse plates hinged to the cuisse, mail sewn into the hose around the back of the knees, or a mail skirt covering the upper thighs and groin. Standard career soldiers seldom wore leg protection and appear to have just accepted the risk of injury in exchange for being lighter on their feet and carrying a lighter load for all those excessive miles of marching during a typical campaign. When you consider that only less than 1% of a soldier's time on campaign was generally spent actually fighting, and the vast majority of the soldier's time was spent on the march and carrying their provisions, it is worth weighing up what you'd consider a priority in terms of safety and survival. The running themes tend to be the helmet and breastplate was most commonplace. Then the arm harness and gauntlets tend to be second most important. The 1400s saw a meteoric rise in mercenary armies and generally inflated army sizes compared to previous centuries. This also came with lengthy itemised invoices for munitions armour, in order to equip the men. In typical medieval admin fashion, the invoices are rarely specific, but time and time again they mention the requirements of helmets and breastplates, yet seldomly mention leg armour. There are three main reasons for this. The first we have already mentioned, regarding what a typical soldier would opt to carry while on campaign, and the limitations of weight that can quickly become a burden for a wary and weathered soldier. Secondly, it is important to state that neither the helmet or the breastplate requires any articulation to function in its role as protection. The helmet can come in various sizes and still be perfectly useful to the wearer. Likewise, a breastplate can be strapped at varying tightnesses to fit a wide variety of combatants. Although distributing the best fitting armour to the right soldier was still a priority, helmets and breastplates are generally easy to wear and very adaptable. Now if we look at leg armour, we see a much more technical example of medieval armour. Leg harness strictly only works if the articulation is working sufficiently. The articulation can only work correctly if the measurements of the adjoining lanes of metal are accurate. Even just a few centimetres out in some places can be detrimental to the leg harness's function. Since leg length varies so much between people, finding an off-the-shelf leg harness for a munitions store that fits perfectly would be considerably rare. Any reenactors would know that finding leg armour and arm armour is the most difficult part of medieval reenactment. Due to this, an uncomfortable fit would almost certainly quickly become a bane of any career soldier's life while on campaign, and would hence be jettisoned immediately. Thirdly, the cost for leg armour during the medieval period would have been considerably higher than the cost for breastplates and helmets. This is just as true in the modern world as it was for the Middle Ages. I do know that a lot of historical reenactors watch my videos, and I can safely assume that they have received quotes for leg armour from modern armories that have certainly made their bank balances shake in fear. This is due to all the articulation involved, and all the working parts that an armourer has to skillfully get right, for it to function correctly and be comfortable for the wearer. The inner thigh has always been a particular hotbed for imaginative armourers to ponder, as the thigh compresses and expands a lot during natural movements such as walking and running, so adding plate armour to the inner and the back of the thighs is not really an option. As we approach the turn of the 16th century and onwards, we do see fully protective leg harnesses which rely on many overlapping lanes of plate armour to achieve maximum flexibility. However, this was generally extremely expensive, usually reserved for specific tournaments, and the sheer skill required for armouring masters to make these features meant that only the richest and most committed armour enthusiasts would ever be able to afford such a technical harness. That being said, This is none other than the tournament harness of King Henry VIII, now displayed at Leeds Royal Armouries, England. Built by the Greenwich Armoury of London in around 1520, this harness was specifically created for a foot combat tournament with polearm usage in mind. The armourers have masterfully added lames of steel to cover the gaps around the inner thigh and the back of the knee. Many strips of metal are shaped to mimic the shape of the king's legs, using rivets placed in key pivot points so each lame can collapse and fold in on itself, allowing for maximum movement. A viewer may look upon this harness and confirm that this solves the issue for protection versus mobility once and for all, being able to achieve both instead of having to settle for a mixture of the two. It is certainly true that the extra coverage will provide better protection, but freedom of movement would still be impacted, and the extra weight from these additional plates of metal would also play a part in hindering the wearer's dexterity, agility and stamina. Of course, this is an example from the early 16th century, not the 15th century. This innovation in leg harness design first came about in the last few decades of the 1400s, however, seemingly pioneered by armourers working for Maximilian of the Holy Roman Empire. Despite this, for almost the entirety of the 15th century, we do see elongated skirts featuring on cuirasses, which were also comprised of several layers of metal lames which would fold and collapse in on each other to provide maximum movement. As the English preferred dismounted combat during this time period, we often see the English variant of these skirts feature 2 or 3 more lames of steel than the European examples. This was done specifically to protect as much of the leg and groin as possible before the skirt became too long and awkward to wear, which would have subsequently then lose its initial benefit. In regards to how someone would successfully take down a fully armoured opponent, it would certainly come as a challenge. Armour of the 15th century was specifically designed to deter glancing strikes and prevent thrusts from bladed weapons. Of course, even full plate armour cannot protect you from everything. There are 3 main ways to defeat a fully armoured opponent. Firstly, crush weapons began rising in popularity for knights during this time. Poleaxes and warhammers were used to bludgeon, causing dents in the armour and delivering blunt force trauma through the armour and into the opponent's body. Broken ribs and collapsed collarbones were a particularly common injury for knights in armour during this time. If the knight is debilitated in such a way that they can no longer function in their armour, they are much easier to take down. Secondly, even the best protective armours will always still have vulnerable areas, as previously mentioned. The back of the leg, the groin, neck and armpits often needed to be exposed to ensure manoeuvrability. They were sometimes covered by a protective layer of mail, but were still considerably less protected than the areas covered by plate armour. While a full harness of plate armour is considerably lighter than most people think, it will still inevitably lower the wearer's dexterity and movement, as well as shifting their centre of balance. As such, grappling was commonplace in a medieval battle, and wrestling your opponent to the ground meant that he would be put in a place of great disadvantage. Clambering on top of your opponent followed by a quick draw of a rondel dagger could then dispense a knight rather easily, although you would now be putting yourself in danger as soon as you lower yourself to the knight who is now laying flat on their back. Often debilitated knights were dragged behind the soldiers' lines and taken for ransom, as an alive knight removed from the battlefield with a rich family was much more important to an army than if he were slain. Ransoms were often the backbone of financing campaigns, and lowly soldiers within the ranks could sometimes strike a quick fortune by luckily capturing the right opponent. In conclusion, leg armour is definitely a valuable component to improve your protection, but like all armour, it comes at a cost. Well-seasoned soldiers clearly often made the choice to ditch leg protection altogether in favour for freedom of movement, being lightweight and reducing their load. Even today we see the same decision being made with the modern military. Helmets and Kevlar body armour is often worn by soldiers, but it is very rare to see any form of leg protection other than perhaps a knee guard. So, to those who asked about leg armour in my previous video, I hope this helps to explain the pros and cons in more detail. Of course, if anyone has any other questions regarding medieval arms and armour, feel free to ask them in the comments section, as I am always more than happy to answer whatever questions I can for you. and I might make a video like this one if I feel it might make for an engaging topic. But for now, thanks for watching.